All right, so let's look at the three different definitions of research problem, problem statement, and statement of purpose. And these all seem kind of similar, but there is a difference. So let's look at the research problem. So a research problem can be defined as an area of concern or a gap in the existing knowledge, something we just don't know about. Or it could be a deviation in the norm or standard that points to the need for further understanding and investigation. There's an underlying reason as to why we're going to investigate it. There's a gap. There's a deviation that says, hey, we need to understand better as a claim that outlines the problem addressed by a study. So it's taken the underlying gap and then it's making a statement saying this is what we're going to do. Now, the statement of purpose should really flow logically from the problem statement. And the statement of purpose is a summary of the overall goal, or you might even see the word aim in some research studies, and that would be the statement of purpose as well. It's the objective, it's the aim, it's the summary of the overall goal. Now, a research question is the same thing as a clinical question, which we already dove into when we developed a PICO and clinical question a couple weeks back. So you really should have a grasp on this already. And this arises by formulating the specific inquiry into a question. Now, well, what is a hypothesis? Well, a research hypothesis is a specific, a clear, and testable proposition or predictive statement about the possible outcome of a scientific research study based on a particular property of a population, such as presumed differences between groups on a particular variable or relationships between variables. So let's look at the difference in all of these terms. And this slide is a really good overview. This comes directly from your textbook, and it talks about how we can look at each of these words or phrases, this terminology, differently, so that when it comes time in your signature assignment to write down what the research problem is and the research question and then the hypothesis, come back to this in your book as well, because this will help you delineate which is which. They're all a bit different, but it can get a little bit confusing and intertwined. So make sure that you review this slide, this box in your textbook, it's table 6.1, and get familiar with how each of these are just a bit different. Now, research problems and paradigms. We already broached this topic a little bit, but there are differences between quantitative and qualitative studies. And in quantitative studies, usually involves concepts that are well developed for which methods of measurement have been or can be developed. Again, we have an independent and dependent variable when we're looking at quantitative studies. All right, these are more concerned with statistics and measuring and seeing what relationship exists, if any, between two variables. Now, qualitative studies are undertaken because a researcher wants to develop a rich, context-bound understanding of a poorly understood phenomenon. And when I say phenomenon, this qualitative studies will help develop a theory about a phenomenon. And so the phenomenon could be a patient's experience or the meaning of their experiences or meaning of a particular phenomenon in their life. Okay, so again, we're not intervening. There's no intervention in a qualitative study. We're not measuring association between two variables. There are no variables in qualitative studies. Research problems and questions, we have already broached on this as well, but research problems and questions are very broad. They're broad enough to include central concerns, but they're narrow enough to serve as a guide to study design. Now, it really depends on the clinical or research question and problem as to how that researcher is going to formulate their particular methodology and how they're going to conduct their study. So when this question comes up on your signature assignment, there's a question that has you look at the research or clinical problem in question and see if the methodology they chose would have been appropriate, or is it appropriate? Did they choose the right methodology? Does it make sense to conduct the study that they did? Now, a problem statement has some components that we should include when we're making the statement. So, identification of the problem, obviously. What is wrong with the current situation? We look at the background. What was the nature, the context of the problem? Scope, how big is it? How many people might be affected? What are the consequences of doing nothing, of not fixing the problem? Knowledge gaps. What information about the problem is lacking? What haven't we studied? Why are we taking the study on? There's obviously something missing. What is it? And the proposed solution. Well, how will the study contribute to the problem's solution? So will our results help? What are we going to do with the results? Once we disseminate them or publish them, how will we get it into, say, the clinical setting? What is it in the clinical setting that will be improved from the research? Now, a good quantitative purpose statement contains the variables, so independent and dependent variables, the participants, and the research site. Where is it going to take place? The statement of purpose also uses words such as purpose, intent, or objective. It helps to identify the theory, the model, or conceptual framework. It uses words to connect the independent and dependent variables, such as related to or comparison of. It positions the independent variable before the dependent variable. Other variables may go in between the two or after the dependent variable. But it mentions both the variables and positions the independent before the dependent. Again, if we can reflect on the independent, that's the intervention that we're doing. The independent variable can be manipulated or changed. The dependent variable is the result or the outcome. It also mentions the specific strategy of inquiry, and it provides general definitions of key variables. What are those variables and what are the definitions so that we can better understand them? So an example, and this is kind of scientific, I'll just read it out here. The purpose of this study is to evaluate a relationship that might exist between oxidative balance and clinical features of PKU and MSUD patients in a South Alabama research facility. The oxidative DNA damage markers and amino acid plasma of 20 controls, 22 MSUD, and 40 PKU patients were measured. Okay, so the purpose of this study is outlined right there. The researchers have said it, and it's very straightforward and contains all the components that we would need. Now, qualitative research purpose statements will present a clear purpose or intent and study a specific idea. The data is descriptive in nature rather than focusing on countable numerical figures. So an example of this might be, and this is taken right out of a research article. The present article describes a qualitative study of the career development of 18 prominent, highly achieving African American, Black, and white women in the United States across 8 occupational fields. Our aim in the study was to explore critical influences on the career development of these women, particularly those related to their attainment of professional success. Again, the researcher has put, instead of the word purpose, they used aim, and that is interchangeable. That is fine too. That is their statement of purpose for this qualitative study. Now, a good research question is essential to guide a research paper, project, or thesis. It pinpoints exactly what the researcher or individual wants to find out and gives the work a clear focus and purpose. A research question is basically a question that a research project sets out to answer. Choosing a research question is an essential part of both quantitative and qualitative research. But good research questions seek to improve knowledge on an important topic or that gap, and are usually narrow and specific. How the question is constructed can depend on the type of research or discipline that it is. Now, a research hypothesis is a specific, clear, and testable proposition or predictive statement about the possible outcome of the research study based on a particular property of a population, such as presumed differences between groups on a particular variable or relationships between variables. It is essentially a theory about something. We are predicting that there's association or some type of association. There's different types of hypotheses, and we'll look at those as we go too. Now, again, a hypothesis is a prediction, but it really involves more than just a guess. So most of the time, the hypothesis begins with a question, which is then explored through background research. And it's only at this point that researchers begin to develop a testable hypothesis. Unless you are creating an exploratory study, your hypothesis should always explain what you expect to happen. Again, the hypothesis is a prediction of what you expect. Now, in a study exploring the effects of a particular drug, the hypothesis might be that researchers expect the drug to have some type of effect on the symptoms of a specific illness. For example, perhaps they're studying a high blood pressure medicine, and they predict or they state in their hypothesis that they expect that high blood pressure medicine that they're intervening with will lower that individual's blood pressure. Now, remember, a hypothesis does not have to be correct. Again, it's just a prediction. It does not have to be correct. We have different types of hypotheses that we'll learn about in the next couple slides. So while the hypothesis predicts what the researchers expect to see, the goal of the research is to determine whether this guess is right or it's wrong. So when conducting an experiment, researchers might explore a number of factors to determine which ones might contribute to the ultimate outcome. Because remember, research does not prove a hypothesis. The results of a study merely support or does not support the hypothesis. Now, a key point to remember is that a hypothesis must be something that you can actually test. A hypothesis often follows a basic format of, well, if this happens, then this will happen. Or if this happens, then that will happen. One way to structure a hypothesis is to describe what will happen to the dependent variable if you make changes to the independent variable. Again, an independent variable can be manipulated. So one way that we can formulate a hypothesis is by saying, well, if we make changes to that manipulative variable or the independent variable, what will happen to the dependent variable? And we can make a prediction. Now, let's look at two different types of hypotheses. A directional hypothesis, it's also called a one-tail hypothesis. It's a prediction made by a researcher regarding a positive or negative change, relationship, or difference between two variables of a population, meaning we can state the direction of the predicted change or influence. Okay, so a directional hypothesis, we can state the direction of the predicted change. Now, a non-directional hypothesis simply predicts the existence of some sort of relationship, but not the direction it will go. So now this is called a two-tailed hypothesis, and it predicts that the independent variable, again, the manipulative variable, will have an effect on the dependent variable, but we don't know the direction. Okay, that direction of the effect is not specified in a non-directional hypothesis. It just predicts the existence of some type of relationship, but not the direction of that relationship. All right, here is where it might get a bit tricky. So we have a good grasp on what a hypothesis is, right? Well, then what is a null hypothesis? This can get a little confusing. Now, a null hypothesis is a general statement or default position that there is no relationship between two measured phenomena or no association among groups. Okay? No association, no relationship. A null hypothesis is a type of hypothesis used in statistics that proposes that there is really no difference between certain characteristics of a population or data generating processes. For example, a gambler, somebody goes into a casino and gambles, a gambler may be interested in whether a game of chance is fair. If it is fair, then the expected earnings per player if it is fair, then the expected earnings per play is 0 for both players. And if the game is not fair, then the expected earnings is positive for one player and negative for the other. To test whether the game is fair, the gambler collects earnings data from many repetitions of the game, calculates the average earnings from these data, and then tests the null hypothesis that the expected earnings is not different from 0. Hang with me. Now, if the average earnings from the sample data is sufficiently far from 0, then the gambler will reject the null hypothesis and conclude the alternative hypothesis, namely that the expected earnings per play is different from 0. So if the average earnings from the sample data is close to 0, then the gambler will not reject the null hypothesis, concluding instead that the difference between the average from the data and 0 is explainable by chance only. A null hypothesis is a type of conjecture used in statistics that proposes that there's no difference between certain characteristics of a population or data generating processes. It just is stating that, well, this just happened by chance, but there's no actual measurable relationship. Now, I know that this can get a bit confusing, and hopefully when we get into the measurement of data, this will start making a bit more sense, but have heart. Even seasoned researchers struggle with these concepts and actually hire statisticians to help them out. Okay, so just remember the simple definition that the null hypothesis just states that there's no relationship. There's an absence of relationship, and it just is explainable by chance alone. All right, let's talk about the terrible P word. Okay, again. Now, the danger in thinking hypotheses prove something is sometimes counterintuitive. Yes? Now, although this word has different meanings in different contexts, most dictionaries indicate that we prove something when we establish its genuineness or authenticity. Proof, therefore, leaves no room for error. If you prove something, you and others can be 100% confident that your claim is true. And since, as we know, all research has room for error, all research has potential for flaw. And when we talked about confounding variables, we don't always know what those are. Okay, they're not always obvious to us. So if all research has room for error, then we can't prove. We can only support, sometimes with great certainty though, our hypothesis. Again, hypotheses are supported or rejected by the study data, but not proven or disproven. Now, for many qualified nurses and nursing students, research is research. And it's often quite difficult to grasp what others are referring to when they discuss the limitations and or strengths within a research study. And that's why we have a whole semester dedicated on looking at a study and answering a 20-something page worksheet on it. Now, research texts and journals refer to critiquing the literature, critical analysis, reviewing the literature, evaluation and appraisal of the literature, which really are in essence the same thing, right? And we're going to be spending a lot of time on that this semester. That's the entirety of our signature assignment. Now, terminology in research can really be confusing for the novice research reader. When caring for patients, it's essential that nurses are using their current best practice. So to determine what this is, nurses really need to be able to read research. Now, the adage, all that glitters is not gold, is also true in research. Not all research is of the same quality or of a high standard, And therefore, nurses shouldn't simply take research at face value simply because it's been published. Critiquing is a systematic method of appraising the strengths and the limitations of a piece of research in order to determine its credibility and or its ability to be applied to practice. The purpose of the aims and objectives of a study, the research question and the research hypothesis, is to form a link between the initially stated purpose of the study or research problem and then how the study will be undertaken. And they should be clearly stated and be congruent with the data presented in the literature review. The use of these items is dependent on the type of research being performed. Okay, so our job as nurses is to evaluate when we're thinking about the research problem. It's to evaluate whether the statement of purpose or research question lend themselves to a research inquiry and to critically appraise and look at this with a keen critical eye to determine whether the research problem is compatible with the chosen research paradigm and its associated methods, or you can think of that as methodology. Now, this is a bit overwhelming, and hopefully with a signature assignment, when we work through just one article, question by question and section by section, this will start coming together for you. I do agree that it's a little confusing. And when I was an undergrad student, I was a bit overwhelmed by all the terminology and what all this meant and how it was all going to come together. And I can tell you that it might not all make sense during your undergraduate degree. And if you go on to graduate level schooling, it will start coming together. I do promise you that. You'll spend more time in this. It'll start making sense. But just remember the purpose of this course. So when you graduate, you will have that consumer of research knowledge to be able to look at a research article and with some degree critically appraise it. And that's it for this presentation. Thanks for hanging in there.